Obviously, we have to do something different, right? There's a lot of talk right now as we approach, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 about these forever wars that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan. And certainly the war on drugs is a forever war. We've been fighting it in South America, Central America, and Mexico now, for decades.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hey y'all, this is Christopher Maraff reporting from Philadelphia. Breaking news regarding the opening of a supervised consumption site in Philly came down on the day we recorded the upcoming episode. If you haven't already heard, on Tuesday, January 12th, a three-judge panel from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals dropped the federal hammer and set back efforts by the nonprofit group Safe House to open America's first legally sanctioned supervised consumption site when it reversed a lower court's ruling that Safe House would not be violating the Controlled Substances Act by opening a supervised consumption site in the city of Philadelphia. In a 2-1 decision, the appeals court adopted a broad interpretation of a section of federal code known as the Crack House Statute that was added to the Controlled Substances Act in 1986 and makes it a felony to knowingly lease, open, rent, use, or maintain any place for the purpose of manufacturing, distributing, or using any controlled substance. Safe House has long maintained that as an overdose prevention site staffed with medical professionals, its primary mission would be saving lives, not facilitating the use of drugs. The Third Circuit rejected that argument, writing in its opinion, quote, Safe House's visitors will have the significant purpose of drug activity. True, some will visit Safe House just for medical services or counseling. Even so, Safe House's main attraction is its consumption room. Safe House officials told me that the ruling does not in any way put an end to their fight. While it may slow down the push for supervised consumption, it's just one battle in a much broader war, protecting the rights of people who use drugs. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the number one priority on most Americans' minds. It's probably best that this get decided in the courts. But who knows, maybe Joe Biden's Department of Justice will surprise us, or Congress will sneak in an amendment to some law that exempts supervised consumption sites from the Crack House Statute. There's still a bunch of moves that can be made from here. What's becoming clearer by the day, however, is that mainstream judicial and health systems are obstacles standing in the way of doing harm reduction, preventing overdoses, and saving lives. I'm happy to report that here in Philadelphia, at least, this work goes on, underground, in unsanctioned trap houses, shooting galleries, and back alleys across the city. The same thing is happening across America. So if you care about this issue, the one thing you can do is carry naloxone in your pocket. That's number one. The second thing is do everything in your power to make sure the person sitting next to you has it too. Because between the two of you, one of you just might save the other's life someday, or a third party you've yet to meet. If you're interested in learning more about this issue, go back and check out episode 31, in which we interview Abraham Gutman, an opinion writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you can go to Filter Magazine and read my numerous columns on the subject. We look forward to seeing how this plays out. And now, on with the show. Hello everyone, I'm Christopher Maraff and you're listening to Narcotica. Today we've got a really interesting interview with a great guest lined up for you. We'll be discussing Mexico's drug war, American foreign policy, and drug policy in general with Scott Stewart, a security analyst who for years penned one of the best annual assessments of Mexico's evolving cartels for Stratfor. He's since transitioned to Torchstone Global, a private security consulting firm. Scott's worked on the trenches of intelligence and security for 35 years. He began his career in Army Reserve and National Guard intelligence, and he spent 10 years as a special agent with the U.S. Department of State's Diplomatic Security Service. During the height of the drug war surge under Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush, Stewart was assigned to protect a Colombian judge who had signed an arrest warrant for Pablo Escobar, who famously killed many of his rivals in politics, including taking down a plane just to get one man. In 1993, he traveled to Bogota to help the government there investigate a car bombing at a school supply market. That work has given him an up-close view of national criminal organizations like drug cartels. His work analyzing cartels has been cited and quoted across the national media, international media really. His life and career is an interesting look at the drug war, the evolution of Mexico as a dominant narco state, and that's something we'll be talking about today, along with the rise of synthetics. Scott, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris.
Also here are Narcotica co-hosts Troy Farah and Zachary Siegel. How are you guys?
Doing okay?
Alive. Alive, yeah, for sure.
So, Scott, the U.S.-Mexico drug war has been going on for so long that it's easy to forget why it started and what its goals even are. Or I should say the U.S. drug war internationally. Mexico itself was kind of a backwater. We didn't really know Mexico for much more than its dirt weed, but at some point that changed and gave rise to the cartels like Sinaloa, Los Zetas, and the major cartels that are battling it out down there for dominance. In 2019, you wrote, "Prison for El Chapo won't end the Sinaloa cartel violence or smuggling." For those listening, El Chapo is Joaquin Guzman, the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel, an international crime organization based in Mexico. Guzman was captured for the third time in 2016 and extradited to the U.S. in 2017. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2019. Scott, why don't you talk about how Mexico became such a dominant player from really a small link in the global war on drugs back in the 80s, and what's going on there today?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that we need to remember is that just because of its proximity to the U.S., there's always been a lot of cross-border smuggling, across the U.S.-Mexico border. And, going back to Prohibition times, obviously you had alcohol coming north. Even before that, you had guns going south to Mexican rebels. Even in more recent times, into the 1900s, we had things like, automobiles and even appliances, kitchen appliances being smuggled into Mexico by criminals for resale because of the profit margins that they could make, bringing stuff across the border. So there's really been a long history of robust smuggling across that border. As you mentioned, it did kind of morph into, as we got into the 1900s, kind of that Mexican, brickweed or dirtweed. But because of those networks that were there, and really, especially in a lot of the big cities on the border, going all the way from Tijuana to Matamoros, as we go from west to east, you just had these structures that were really primed to be able to get into other drugs. It really wasn't a big deal in the cocaine flow until we saw that kind of the formal war on drugs during the Reagan administration and, the very big efforts to crack down on the Caribbean corridor. So this is like, the Miami Vice days, when you had, these go fast boats and planes bringing all this stuff in, through the Bahamas, and dropping it in South Florida, and really through maritime interdiction and really focusing on that corridor, they were able to kind of, shut it down. I shouldn't say shut it down. They really stopped the flow or lessened the flow. It's never stopped. There's always been dope coming up through the Caribbean. But still, these efforts cut off a lot of the flow. And that left the Colombians looking for, other ways and other means to smuggle their dope. And that's what brought them into contact with some of the then powerful marijuana cartels in Mexico, such as the Guadalajara cartel on the West Coast. That later broke up and became, these groups that we know, such as Sinaloa, Juarez cartel, Tijuana cartel. And then on the East Coast, we had the Gulf cartel, which is, we still have remnants of the Gulf cartel on the East Coast. And of course, many of their splinters, such as Los Zetas. And so it was really that need, to find alternate ways to move cocaine to the U.S. that supercharged the Mexican criminals, because the profits that they were realizing on cocaine were much larger than what they were getting on the marijuana. And that just really gave them the war chests they needed to become very powerful, pay a lot of bribes, buy a lot of guns and gunmen. And that kind of brought them up to the Narcos Mexico on Netflix that we see.
What is it about Mexico that's made it difficult for one or two dominant players to kind of consolidate the market the way Escobar did, and it's so balkanized? What's unique about it as a state, or about its its drug trade? Is it the ownership of the plazas where it crosses the border, or is it something more about like the geographical layout?
Well, I mean, you do have that fragmented geography somewhat. And obviously that's one of the things that's made it difficult for Mexico City to exert control in the Sierra. It's made it very difficult for them really in the northern deserts, along the U.S. border. It's always been difficult to exert control over banditry and, illegal activity, and even, rebels in some of these areas over the years. But I think that really we did have two major Mexican groups operating, and they were doing pretty well and making a lot of cash. And what really splintered them up, much like what we saw in Colombia, was, law enforcement action to basically decapitate them. And that's what, that's what resulted in the breakdown of the Guadalajara cartel was, the DEA just declaring war on them after the Camarena torture and murder. And that then, resulted in them splintering down. And then they started interfighting. And then we saw the same thing happen with the Gulf cartel after the arrest of Osio Cardenas-Guillen. It caused a lot of splintering as everybody within these organizations were fighting. Of course, think about it overall. Even in organized crime in other places, whether it's, Italy, whether it's the Balkans, whether we're talking, American organized crime, in cities and regions, there's always a lot of greed. There's a lot of jealousy. Sometimes you have personal disputes. Somebody sleeps with somebody's sister or girlfriend or wife, and, then people die. So there's a lot of dynamics that can kind of drive that division, but pretty much it's greed that we see. I would say is probably the number one problem, combined kind of with ego that's driving, the violence and the splintering in places like Mexico.
So this sort of like cut the head off the snake kind of tactic and approach has been the U.S.'s approach here. And back to what Chris was mentioning, you wrote a piece in 2019 about why prison for El Chapo won't end the cartel violence or the smuggling. And so what is it about, jailing El Chapo or cutting the head off the snake that fails to meaningfully change the trajectory of drug sales or trafficking or violence?
Yeah, I mean, that's got really several parts. First of all, the decapitation does have an impact on these organizations. And one of the things that we see is it does tend to cause them to fragment, and it takes them to the point where they aren't strong enough to really challenge the state anymore. And that's what we've seen in Colombia, for example. In the 90s, early 90s, we had Escobar specifically at the point where he was challenging the power of the state and with force. He took out the DAS building, their internal security service, with a dump truck bomb. He leveled a city block. So he was basically waging insurgent warfare in the Colombian capital against the cops. We still see, cocaine trade in Colombia today. It hasn't gone away, but what's happened is these groups are more fragmented, and none of them are strong enough to really pose a threat to the central government. And that's kind of the same thing we see happening in Mexico. The Guadalajara cartel and even the Gulf cartel to a little bit lesser extent were very powerful. And they could challenge the government's mandates, at least citywide or regionally. But certainly they were getting to the point where they were so influential. They had so many claws into even the federal government with bribery and such, that they really did pose a threat to the government. And today, the violence continues at a terrible rate. But none of those organizations at this point is really strong enough to really challenge the government one-on-one. Not even Sinaloa or the CJNG, which are the two big dogs right now.
So it sort of fractures and splinters and weakens them at the kind of organizational level and kind of disrupts the hierarchy. And though, like, the that's an effect happening on the ground in Mexico or Colombia or these countries. Though, how does the business side keep going? Because like I don't recall after El Chapo there was like a drought of black tar heroin or anything like that. You know, like how does the business and the trafficking kind of go on uninterrupted then?
Well, the strength of their kind of organization is kind of also disorganization. You know, we talk about these fragments. And so, for example, you know, with the breakdown of the Guadalajara cartel, you had kind of, you know, these other mini cartels take over, and basically most of the border from Juarez over to Tijuana. And, of course, also controlled the grow areas in the Golden Triangle in the mountains. And, you know, they would either work together, sometimes at cross purposes, but they were still able to get, you know, not only the cocaine up and through Mexico, but then, you know, also we saw the continuation of the marijuana cultivation. Then we saw the rise of Mexican heroin, you know, which basically has dominated and currently dominates the American market. And then, of course, all these synthetic drugs that we're going to be talking about. But they're all involved in the trade. They all have their you know, contacts and their routes. And so it's you know, even within, for example, the Sinaloa cartel, you know, we always think about them as one, you know, just total hierarchy, but it really wasn't. It really was a federation of other groups, lesser groups, working together. It wasn't just El Chapo, but you had other people, El Azul, you had El Mayo, the Valencia family. There were several smuggling clans, the Salazar, these other clans, you know, in that western portion that are very powerful, that were kind of united together under the Sinaloa umbrella, but they all had kind of like their individual businesses going, and they could cooperate, support each other and such. But taking down one of them or one of the leaders didn't necessarily wipe out everybody. And so you still have, you know, the flow continuing, despite taking out, you know, one kind of central person or central mode. You know, think about the Beltran-Leyva family was another powerful family that was involved under the Sinaloa umbrella. Guys like Ignacio Coronel. And so you had all these kind of players had their own businesses. You know, when you look at the seizures of you know, big seizures of dope that happen, you know, you see the bricks are often marked with different stamps, you know, belonging to different families, different organizations within some of the larger organizations. And so that's why even when you take out kind of one portion of that group, you know, the others continue to operate and do business.
So rewinding a little bit, where does your work come into play, Scott? You're a longtime analyst and investigator. You were in the trenches in Bogota during the 80s, tasked with a diplomatic security mission to protect a judge on Pablo Escobar's hit list. And that's like straight out of a spy novel, pretty much. And I assume there's a lot you probably can't discuss openly, but so our listeners can get a better sense of what you do. Tell us about your work and how it overlaps with national crime organizations in the drug trade.
Well, yeah, actually, Troy, what happened with the judge detail, I was actually assigned in Washington at that time. I was a newer agent, and that was in 1989. There was actually a very young female judge, and she I think she was 32 or 33. And, you know, she was very idealistic, just out of law school, and she signed that arrest warrant for Pablo Escobar. The Colombians couldn't protect her, you know, and she was going to be whacked. And there were several judges who were killed in Colombia for having dared, you know, to work against Escobar. And so the Colombians decided they couldn't protect her, so they made her a diplomat and assigned her to the OAS, the Organization of American States, Colombian mission in D.C., and said, here, America, now, you know, she did your bidding, you know, put this arrest warrant out for Escobar. Now you guys have to keep her safe. You know, for us, that was a very tense detail. Because of the price on her head. And of course, during that time frame, you know, think about the late 80s, early 90s, you know, that's when DC was kind of murder central in the U.S. It was the murder capital of America. We had a lot of gang activity, and a lot of that gang activity revolved around crack cocaine. And so we had a lot of fear that, you know, basically Escobar could send a shipment of coke up to DC and trade it off to have her whacked. Fortunately, that didn't happen. And boy, I've got hours of kind of weird, funny stories about hanging out with the judge. She got pregnant while we were protecting her. It wasn't any of us. It was her husband. We had us taking her to the OBGYN appointments. And the guys on the detail, we were all very different. And so you'd have me, the skinny white guy, taking her to her OBGYN appointment one week. And the next week, it would be my partner, who is like this, Danny Glover looking, 6'5" black dude. And we just figured that the doctors and nurses had to have been really confused about what was going on, there.
Yeah, that's wild. Wow. So from there, like I'm sure there's so many anecdotes and stories, and as we sort of talked about offline a moment ago, that you're sort of like the Forrest Gump, of recent history, and like you're finding yourself in all these crazy situations, like protecting a judge and taking her to the OBGYN. Like, yeah, that's an interesting line of work. And yeah.
Well, in '93, you go back to you go to Colombia. Was that your first time there in country?
No, actually, we had actually helped with a couple bombings down there. But the 93 bombing was kind of interesting. But for me personally, because it was kind of sandwiched between a couple other trips. I had actually come out of Yemen. I did a trip over there looking at the first Al-Qaeda attacks against the U.S. There again, Forrest Gump, right? And then we did the Bogota investigation. And then I was assigned really for the next couple of years to the Trade Center bombing that happened in February 93. So it was kind of a very busy time for me. But it was really interesting. One of the kind of crazy things that we found, we helped the Colombians do the crime scene investigation of the bombing. And especially at that time, the Colombian National Police just weren't necessarily as well trained as they are today. They're pretty good today, and they've received a lot of U.S. training, in investigative techniques. Back in those days, basically their investigation would be kind of like some national police, like Colonel rolls up to the scene smoking a cigar, looks at it and says, "Oh yeah, that's 200 pounds of dynamite," and walks away. And then somebody writes that up. That's their investigative report. But we went down to kind of help them, and help them with some techniques. So we're running around, crawling through the crater, picking up pieces of the device, and to try to help them figure out, how it was constructed, what the components were. And actually, one of the cool anecdotal things out of that investigation is that we were able to determine from pieces we found, when something explodes, it just doesn't vaporize. It'll break things up and hurl them sometimes at a distance, but they don't disappear. If you do a careful examination of a bombing, a lot of times you can find components of the stuff that was actually used. Think about that little fragment of the circuit board from Pan Am 103, for example. But in this case, we found some components that belonged to Futaba model aircraft remote control sets. And so that allowed us to conclude and determine that basically Escobar's Sicarios, who were conducting these bombings in Colombia, and they would go on to do some others, were using these Futaba remotes to complete the circuit and detonate their devices. And the good news on that, I guess from an investigative standpoint, is there was only one shop in all of Colombia that sold those sets. And so we were able to kind of get the cops going in the right way to finally track down and arrest the bomb maker. Within, probably another year or so, they were able to track him down, take him off the street, and kind of end the wave of bombings.
What was like the motivation for these kinds of bombings? Like about power, obviously, but can you get into sort of like what would lead a drug trafficking organization to do what amounts to terror?
Yeah, it really was narco-terrorism. One of the major motivations for Escobar was that he feared being extradited to the United States. It's kind of funny now that we see guys like El Chapo and Ocel Cardenas Guillen, living out that nightmare. But that was basically, one of the huge demands was that they did not want to be extradited to the United States to face U.S. justice. They wanted to stay, if anything, if they were going to be arrested, they wanted to stay in Colombia, where they could have those very comfortable prisons with their private chefs and girlfriends and, luxury suites.
Would you say that Narcos was a fairly adequate, true-to-life portrayal of those times? Did you watch the series?
Yes and no. I mean, I think anytime that you try to do something for television, you have to take some dramatic license. I think in many ways they were true to the how should I say, the spirit of what was going on, but they had a lot of factual inaccuracies as well. And especially I noticed that in Narcos Mexico, just because of kind of things I understood and knew were going. It was great for TV, but some of the stuff just didn't happen like they portrayed it.
Can you give like an example of that?
Well, I mean, they had certain individuals being executed and killed who weren't, people who ended up going to jail, and they showed them being executed kind of blatantly because it was good TV,
Yeah, I haven't actually watched the show myself. So the overdose crisis and drug problems domestically in America are framed very differently than they are in Mexico and other Latin American countries. And I think it's kind of important to get beyond a U.S.-centric look at the, quote, drug war. The main casualties of the drug war in Mexico are not from drugs per se or people using drugs and overdosing, but rather from bloody, violent skirmishes over turf and who controls trafficking routes. And journalists are often targeted a lot as well. Can you put into perspective how deadly Mexico's drug wars are, how many people are killed and disappeared by these organizations? And journalists are often targeted a lot as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. You talk about kind of the narco terror. That's definitely part of it when it comes to journalists in Mexico. I would push back a little bit on the the concept that addiction is not a problem in Mexico. And I believe that it's always been a problem, but I think it's becoming more acute, especially as we're seeing breakdowns in the big organizations. And we're seeing a lot of the transactional stuff that's happening as, people move dope through plazas, for example. Instead of paying in cash, they may pay people in kind. And so there's a lot of use going on right now south of the border, and it is becoming a growing and very, very significant public health issue in Mexico. And not just in Juarez, not just in Reynosa or Matamoros, but also, places like Monterrey, places like Guadalajara, places like Mexico City. So it really is an increasing issue in Mexico as well.
Yeah, certainly wasn't trying to imply that addiction and overdose isn't a serious issue in Latin America and Mexico, only that the media sort of hypes the violence. But that's a good perspective to have. Can I talk to you a little bit about how cannabis legalization in the U.S. has had an impact on drug trafficking and stuff like that south of the border?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, it's been interesting because obviously as you get higher quality weed in the U.S., kind of the demand for kind of the skunky Mexican stuff is not as high. But still there are people, that don't want to spend the cash for the good stuff. And so it's, it's still coming over the border and we're still seeing them bring that. One of the interesting things I've been looking at though for the last couple years has been kind of the increase in them kind of boiling down into like hash oil and kind of the THC concentrates for vaping and such, as kind of a way to adapt to changing kind of appetites in the U.S. market. And so we're definitely seeing the Mexicans becoming much more involved in that. And some of that, there's also connections and kind of tie-ins to the legal, kind of cannabis market as well. I've seen some reporting that indicates that, basically the Mexican cartels have put a lot of money into the legitimate cannabis industry in the United States as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, like you need a lot of capital to buy into the legal cannabis market. And I've always wondered, there's tons of venture capital flowing around the U.S. And I've always wondered, is some of this money funding capital to buy into the legal market? Like, surely some of it has come from the underground illegal market, I suppose. And I haven't definitively seen evidence of that, but it stands to reason that some of that money is for sure propping up the legal market.
Yeah, there's also interested in getting their hands on the Mexican organizations, getting their hands on some of the hybrids that are being produced here, some of the technologies that are being produced here to kind of help their own industry and kind of the growing and burgeoning kind of designer marijuana market in Mexico as well. Places, these, urban areas with, the upscale clientele, they don't like the nasty brick weed either. So, there's a lot of kind of flow there.
Maybe this is a good pivot over to like synthetic drug production, because agricultural drug production, like growing fields of poppy, like that's becoming obsolete in the face of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl labs, presumably in Mexico, cranking out these weird fentanyl analogs that then get, mixed into various powders in cities around the U.S. And that's really what's driving so many overdose deaths these days. And so it's like between these factories producing methamphetamine, which is also synthetic, you don't need sunlight or fields of plants and land, and you don't have to pay farmers and all that. So how is like synthetic drug production just kind of changing the game in Mexico?
Yeah, I talked a little while ago about how, cocaine was a game changer for the cartels and really, gave them a lot of funding and a lot of resources to grow and really become more dangerous and bigger. We really saw the same thing happening with initially methamphetamine. And there again, not just because of the fact that you don't need, people to grow it or crop space, but because of the profit margins. The profit margins were just astronomical. And so the organizations that were the kind of the early adopters of methamphetamine had a very big competitive advantage over, their rivals. So we saw like the Colima cartel, for example, the Mescua brothers, Ignacio Coronel, the King of Crystal. These guys were really making a lot of cash for Sinaloa early on. And that gave them a competitive advantage over the people they were fighting against. And that's really, if you look at kind of the emergence of meth in Mexico and that market and the money it provided to Sinaloa, there's a pretty direct correlation really to their offensive operations to take over plazas on the border, because, they initially they didn't have anything for themselves. So we saw them initially try to take Reynosa away after Ociel Cardenas Guillen was arrested. They made a push. They sent the BLO, Beltran-Leyva organization guys up to try to take Reynosa. And we had this big border war erupt in Reynosa. Things went crazy. And that was all, basically funded by these profits, from this new profit center, this new profit pool they had. They made a push on Juarez. They made a push on Tijuana. And so they were very aggressive. And a lot of this aggression was funded by these resources they had that they were generating from the Colima guys, from Ignacio Coronel, et cetera, as they were, making all this meth. And of course, that then caused their rivals to start cranking up synthetics. And it's not just something anymore that one cartel is moving. Almost every organization of any size in Mexico right now is pushing meth because of the profitability there and the power that gives them and the ability that gives them to wage war against their enemies.
Scott, I had a DEA source once tell me that it was the crackdown really on production domestically of meth that sort of pushed these super labs to develop in Mexico and overseas. So, I guess the first question would be, is that an example of, a domestic policy platform in the U.S. war on drugs, creating and perhaps even worse in his assessment, the price went down and the quality went up when it went below south of the border. And second to that, I would ask if you've heard or have any evidence of any collaboration between, Chinese triads and Mexico's cartels in the precursor trade. Is there any kind of alliance that you've uncovered or anything you can tell us about Chinese organized crime and its role?
Okay, first question first. Yeah, just as we saw the kind of the war on drugs in the Caribbean corridor send coke into Mexico and enrich the cartels that way, the coke flow from South America. That's exactly what happened once we went into California and Oregon and started shutting down the labs there, especially places like the Central Valley of California. That just really sent the production south of the border and really ramped things up. So absolutely. And as you say, not only did we have prices go down, but purity and strength went up at the same time.
And that was linked to like the pseudoephedrine ban, right? Also, that was
it's all linked. Now that also ties in now to China, and at the same time, that this was going on. We had these kind of alliances and deals being made between Mexican cartels and Chinese organized crime, and they just started shipping, large quantities of meth precursors into Mexico to fuel these super labs. Initially, we were seeing a lot of stuff out of India as well, but the DEA put a lot of pressure, and they were able to kind of not shut down, but curtail, if you will, a lot of the Indian supply of precursors. And so that just left China as probably, the main source of precursor chemicals, although we've seen stuff coming in from Europe and elsewhere as well, South America. But still, the Chinese connection has been a very, very long held one, a very important one, and very lucrative for everybody. Do you guys remember that, what was the guy's name? Zhu Longji or whatever that was arrested in Mexico City with like the $100 million in cash in his house?
I heard that story. Yeah. $100 million in cash. Like, I think I saw pictures, like it took up the whole basement or something.
Yeah, it was crazy. And that was just one guy, just one supplier to one cartel. And that just kind of shows how big and how lucrative that trade is. For everybody. Another thing that where Chinese organized crime has really helped the Mexican groups has been in the way of trade-based money laundering. And it's pretty amazing. In a lot of traditional money laundering schemes, kind of black market peso exchanges, that sort of thing, the groups that were seeking to launder the cash and to get it out of the U.S. and kind of repatriate it back to their home country, generally would have to pay money, a percentage on the cash to get that done and to get it back. And so you had these bankers and others, making a lot of money, doing the laundering. One of the interesting things that has happened with the trade-based money laundering out of China has been that it has allowed these Mexican groups to use their cash from the U.S. to buy counterfeit luxury goods and other stuff out of China that are then shipped into Mexico and sold in Mexico, and then they get the money back. They get the cash back, that way by selling the goods on the street. And interestingly enough, instead of losing money, in many of the trade-based laundering schemes, they're actually making money. In fact, I had somebody with a very good knowledge of this tell me that basically the markup on counterfeit Nike sneakers, that the Mexicans were bringing in through trade-based money laundering in Mexico City was higher than they were getting on cocaine going to the U.S.
What? Selling Nikes?
Luxury goods, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, that goes back to like selling the kitchen appliances, like back in the early 1900s or whatever. Like this stuff is just like we're just kind of trapped in this history, aren't we?
Yeah, and they're very entrepreneurial. And even aside from things like the apparel and the Gucci bags and that kind of stuff, they also were big into software piracy, DVD and CD piracy, even like counterfeit electronics, fake Sonys, fake Rolexes, all this kind of stuff. And they were making money off of all of it, which is actually pretty ingenious if you think about it. They're not only making money moving the dope, but then they're making money getting their money back out of the U.S., through this trade-based money laundering.
One thing I've heard that's really interesting is the legal trafficking of avocados. People make fun of people for having avocado toast or whatever. I think they're delicious. I live in Southern California, so we get them pretty well. But thinking about where your avocados come from and how it could have been smuggled by a cartel or something is an interesting thing to me.
Yeah, and there again, when you talk about them, these cartels have so much cash. And they've generated so much that they've had to have places to put it. But they also invested because, they're smart money people. And so a lot of these resorts, quite frankly, that you're seeing in places, whether it's a Riviera Maya or whether it's places, Puerto Vallarta, wherever, a lot of these resorts are funded, to launder drug money. They've invested in legitimate farms. They've also, though, at the same time, we have organized crime groups really kind of put the squeeze on legitimate farmers. And it's not just avocados. Of course, that's kind of a famous thing because of Michoacan and the Tierra Caliente area, but also things like, other citrus farmers, who are raising, products that are used in soft drinks, things like Coca-Cola, et cetera. Those people have been squeezed really hard. In some places, they've basically either been extorted out of business or just basically had their farms and businesses subsumed by organized crime, who's now carrying it on and profiting, from the businesses these people worked hard to set up. It's really very tragic.
Scott, you mentioned Al Qaeda earlier, and Yemeni. You were in Yemen early on. The ideological foundation of Islamic terrorism would seem to be anti-drug, one would think, but I think as time has gone on, there's been more of an immersion of narco-terrorism and Islamic terrorism. I know that there's a theory that some synthetic cannabinoid money flows back to the Middle East, where it's used to fund terror operations. I don't know how much truth there is in that, but have you seen sort of a confluence of these two types of terror evolve over the years?
Well, probably more so with the Marxist groups, specifically in Colombia, where basically the FARC have become a cartel. The ELN, these other groups are all cartels now. And certainly the Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan has become a huge manufacturer of heroin, for a large portion of the globe, especially in Eurasia. And now they're, starting to manufacture more and more methamphetamine. So there definitely is, you mentioned the Captagon, and these other drugs that are tied into places like Syria and Iran. And certainly, Al Qaeda in Iraq has been involved, with drug smuggling. So there definitely is involvement. I mean, Hezbollah, for example, Hezbollah has a huge illicit drug network that's all over the world, and they're involved in everything from hashish and heroin to selling counterfeit Viagra in Detroit. So those guys are just kind of everywhere and have their tentacles in things as well. But kind of the idea, and I've heard a lot of people talk about over the years the idea that the Mexican cartels would partner up with these terrorist groups like Hezbollah or, Al Qaeda to smuggle, weapons and fighters into the U.S. I just totally discount that because it would be terrible business for the Mexicans. First of all, they saw what happened to Escobar, right? They don't want to be Escobar. Secondly, they also understand that they want to have sustainable business. And yeah, they could get a little bit of cash from smuggling, a team of 20 guys or a nuclear weapon or something across the border, but that would end their business. It would be bad for business, and it's not sustainable. It's not something that they're really interested in. So we had a case several years ago where we had a guy from Texas, I think he was from Round Rock or San Antonio, somewhere around Austin there. This guy, our Bobsiar, traveled down to Nuevo Laredo looking for a hitman. And he was looking to hire Los Zetas, because he figured they were like the baddest dudes on the continent, and wanted to hire Los Zetas to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. And he had been put up to this task by the IRGC, the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And, this Iranian plot was kind of nipped in the bud because basically the cartel guys dimed him out to the DEA. They're like, we don't want anything to do with this. Then he ended up meeting with the DEA informant, and the whole plot was crappy. But
that's a crazy story.
The Mexicans don't want to mess with real terrorism.
Yeah. So like framing this question, it sounds like it's a conspiracy, but it's just like, people drawing lines and noticing trends. And so in, the 60s and 70s, when the U.S. invaded Vietnam, there's that story of huge heroin shipments coming back to the U.S. And there was a heroin boom, not just among soldiers in Vietnam, but among citizens in the U.S. where heroin was coming from, like the Golden Triangle and such. And then people also noticed that starting in the early aughts and around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, we also then see this heroin boom. And there's, images of soldiers guarding poppy fields in Afghanistan, or there's like this 2010 story from the New York Times that's like about the U.S. turning a blind eye to opium farmers and sort of for diplomatic reasons letting opium farmers in Afghanistan continue to grow for I don't know why. But can you sort of talk about that? Like when you're presented with these parallels between the countries we invade and what we bring back, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that definitely, one of the other things to think about is just the personal point of it. There were a lot of American soldiers, tens of thousands of them, in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of them. And certainly a percentage of them did get hooked and did get exposed to, both marijuana and heroin while they're over there. And so then a lot of them brought those addictions back to the U.S. Probably not some small number of them figured out that they could make money by, fueling the addictions of others, supplying the addictions of others. And so, we had, but at that time, we definitely, saw that flow was coming from Southeast Asia, predominantly the heroin into the U.S. I would, in the aughts, we're seeing, specifically in the United States, our heroin supplies not coming from Afghanistan. And, the vast majority of Afghan heroin today ends up in Eurasia, a lot of it in Russia or Eastern Europe, and it doesn't necessarily make it here. So I don't know if there's that direct parallel, but certainly, where we have people, travel abroad, pick up addictions and bring those addictions back, that's certainly going to be a connection.
Yeah. So you're saying like that because the Afghanistan poppy and heroin, like that's not really making it all the way to the U.S. That kind of parallel, just like when people are drawing these lines, like that one doesn't necessarily stand up.
No, but certainly I do think that there's there again, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist. One of the things that has made it difficult to clamp down on the flow of synthetic precursor chemicals from China has been kind of a Chinese attitude of, let's give it to the Americans. Look what they did to us with the opium wars.
A reverse opium war, right?
Right. Exactly.
Payback.
Around 93, 94, Southeast Asia just drops out as a player in the heroin trade east of the Mississippi River. And Colombia pretty much takes over in what it seemed to be a bloodless coup. And, it's always it's been mysterious to me why that happened, although I have attributed it somewhat to the regrowing of poppies in Colombia after this coca era, and a lot of the coca trade had been, at least diminished with the demise of the Medellin and Cali cartels. But suddenly poppies are being grown again in Colombia, and Colombian heroin invades the East Coast. And I've had this sort of pet theory that synthetics is, Asian criminal organizations, it's their offensive to get back some of the business they lost then, because pretty much all the heroin east of the Mississippi River was Southeast Asian in the 80s and early 90s, and Colombia then just takes over as the dominant player, and now it's been pushed to Mexico, and I guess maybe you could speak to what did the Colombians have, what would be in their invested interest in teaching, as I understand they sent cooks to teach them how to make purified white heroin. What would be their incentive?
Well, I think for the specific cooks that did that, it was strictly monetary. They were being paid to come up and teach them how to make the white heroin. But I think that you're pretty right on the dynamics, and I believe that one of the factors that allowed the Colombians to kind of capture that huge market share was the fact that due to proximity to the U.S. and due to just the lack of multiple middlemen, that a lot of the heroin that was coming in from Colombia was stepped on less. And so it was basically better and cheaper than what was coming in, from Southeast Asia. And we've seen the same thing happening really to an extent with Mexico. I mean, the stuff that's coming in from Mexico is very good, very strong, and pretty cheap. So they kind of have a competitive advantage being closer, less of a supply chain, and, producing something that people want at a cheap price.
We talked a bit about the coronavirus and how it's affected our lives before we went live on the air here. And I was going to ask you if you've seen any diminished or change in the trade cross-border as a result of the pandemic.
That's a great question. Whether or not the pandemic has had much of an impact. And I have a little bit of a personal axe to grind, because we had people coming on in April and May, people talking publicly, saying that the pandemic was going to be the end of the Mexican cartels, and they were going to collapse because of this. And that concept is ridiculous, and quite frankly, it has been borne out by what we've seen. Due to history, the Mexican cartels have proven themselves to be exceptionally agile, creative, and flexible, and in everything from where they get precursors from to the types of drugs they use, how they smuggle them. They're just very creative, very flexible, very resourceful. And so certainly, we look back now almost a year. We can say for certain that it has not caused the Mexican cartels to collapse. As we look at, just even the last couple of weeks, they continue to wage some pretty nasty wars down there between themselves. Guanajuato right now is just a mess. So they have not collapsed. We're not seeing any sort of reduction in the seizures in Mexico or even in the U.S. We're still seeing very large seizures of synthetics, and things like fentanyl have been way up because that's kind of the new profit pool for them has been fentanyl. So we're really seeing that increasing as more and more organizations across Mexico adopt it. Because of the profitability, just like they did meth earlier. So we're seeing almost all these organizations moving meth, moving fentanyl, still moving, their traditional drugs. We're seeing that, the heroin, the cocaine, the marijuana. But, the COVID pandemic has not stopped them at all. It's just changed how they move stuff because it's changed how commerce moves.
So maybe, wrapping up and piggybacking off this last point about how durable and agile and creative and frankly ingenious some of these organizations are. I think about the decades of U.S. drug policy and is there any approach, bar from all-out war, that can take drug production and manufacturing and sales and trafficking and all that out of the hands of cartels, so other than, legalize and regulate. That's something I hear often, where people are like, if we just legalize and regulate the drugs, that'll put the cartels out of business. What do you say to that argument?
I'm not sure. Obviously we have to do something different, right? There's a lot of talk right now as we approach, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 about these forever wars that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan. And certainly the war on drugs is a forever war. We've been fighting it in South America, Central America, and Mexico now, for decades. But that said, I don't know if legalization in itself will end it because, quite frankly, even the legalization of marijuana hasn't ended, the cartels, marijuana. It's changed it, but it hasn't ended their marijuana business. They adapt. I do think we need to think about creative ways to address this, and specifically, quite honestly, on the demand side. I really see this as being an economic problem. Obviously, there's a huge law enforcement facet, but economics drives it. It's the economics. As long as Americans or Canadians, other North Americans are willing to spend, large quantities of money to buy these substances, people are going to find ways to get them here to sell them to us. I'm not saying abandon the supply side fight, but really, I believe the key's on the demand side.
I think we all sort of agree with that, right? We've talked a lot about the supply side during this talk, and it's a fascinating topic. But I think on our end, reporting on this for years, I also agree that addressing demand and the conditions that drive people to desire substances has to be at the forefront. And I, like, my own personal take on this is like drug use and altering our consciousness has been part of being human as a species for as long as we've had a historical record. So I just don't see how we can stop people from wanting to use drugs because it's so foundational to being human.
Interestingly, we talked about COVID for a bit. When the stay-at-home order was instituted in Philadelphia, the demand, it wasn't, let's address the demand of why people are using drugs, but there wasn't enough money for people to buy their drugs. The hustles were disappearing, and I talked to dealers who were selling 60 bundles a day that dropped down to 10. I heard stories of corners sort of grabbing people walking by to their competitor and making them buy from them. It was a demand side impact, but it just had to do with I don't think it was long enough, and certainly people started getting pandemic money within a short enough time that it probably didn't have any impact on a scale that it would affect international trafficking, but it certainly affected local trafficking here on the ground, local sales.
Well, Scott, I guess that's a good place to wrap up. Really appreciate you coming on the show, giving us a lot of insight and your backstory. Is there anything else you want to mention? Anything else that you want people to know about this topic of, international drug policy?
Well, yeah, I think it's, the important thing is that we really look at, as you guys have been saying, going back that whole supply chain and just seeing kind of the death and misery and destruction that it has. And right now, as we see, these organizations fighting for primacy in Mexico, just the carnage that is being created due to our appetites here in America. And, it's really sad to see, the consequences, of these illicit markets. And certainly, just out of I guess, just, consciousness or out of, humanity, we really do need to find better ways to combat that. I don't have the answer. I wish I did. But certainly, we as a nation and we as Americans really need to find a better way to end this demand so that we can end just the carnage and suffering that our illicit appetites are causing in these other countries.
Yeah, I think, we don't have the answers either. I think, part of that is bringing up the issue and raising awareness so that people can be aware of this. Even illicit appetites are driving so much suffering in the world. You could talk about our demand for oil or electronics, that are mined, the raw materials of lithium and cobalt and stuff like that are mined using child labor. That's not illegal, but I think America is really having a reckoning right now, and we need to take a long, hard look at all of the things that we are consuming, legal and illegal.
That's a great point.
Well said. It's a beautiful world, and I don't want to see our appetites destroy it.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Where can people find you?
Well, guys, thanks for having me on. My company is Torchstone Global, and you can find us at that website. I actually write columns for the Watch section of our website. I have a lot of stuff there on kind of personal security, staying safe, how threat actors work, stuff like that. So there's a lot of good things that people can see. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. Twitter, my handle is @stick631. And if you're interested in kind of international affairs, I talk a lot about, Mexico, Colombia, other things. I look a lot at drugs in addition to kind of crime and terrorism.
Great. We'll post all those links for sure.
Awesome. Thanks so much again for coming on.
Absolutely. It was great talking with you.
Hey, thanks for listening to Narcotica. A big thanks to our patrons over on Patreon for making this show possible. We have a growing list of supporters, and we really could not do this show without them. So thank you guys so much. And if you like what we do here, maybe you would consider joining them. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and Troy Farah. Our theme music is by Glassboy, additional music is by Chandeliers, and I'm your co-producer, Garrett. Give us a like and a follow wherever you get your podcast, and be sure to spread the word. It's really fucking cold in here. I'm gonna go now. Have a nice night.